Shaping international cybersecurity norms for the better is a long-term challenge. To date, most of these challenges have been taken on by nation states themselves. So what you have is state-to-state discussions that have primarily been about military-to-military cooperation around norms of behavior that are basically derived from the law of armed conflict. The challenge, though, is that today cyberspace is really huge and it is growing. You know, by the year 2025, most of the planet will be connected, and we've seen tremendous connectivity just in the past 10 years. The challenge is all of these people have a role to play in setting cyberspace policy. Today, the reason we think cybersecurity norms are so important from a private sector perspective is that a nation state may take some small action in pursuit of national security, but it could affect over 1 billion users. So the state may accomplish their objective, but they could have put 1 billion people and businesses at risk. And that's where we think we need a much more comprehensive discussion between the public and the private sector to understand really what's at stake here. Today, you see recently, for example, the US and China have come to some sort of agreement about what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. I think that's the beginning of a much longer and more complicated dialogue. When I talk to colleagues, for example, who are international diplomats and work on diplomacy for a living, they have this sort of notion that, hey, states will really work this problem out. Let the big developed countries that have offensive and defensive technologies for cyber, let us figure out what the rules of the game are, and then we'll add the rest of the world. From a private perspective, I just don't think that's the right approach. And I'll give you 2 examples. You know, if you think about the Chemical Weapons Convention, that was something that happened between governments, but leveraged a lot of expertise from the private sector to understand how chemicals are made, what they're made, how you would track it, how you would verify a control regime. And secondly, if you go way back to, you know, the 18th century or 17th century, when you think about the laws of the sea, they were not constructed by governments. They were really written by people who were driving commerce at the time. And it's much like that with cyberspace. The people who build the technology and are aware of what happens when things go terribly wrong, and indeed are the people who have to build fixes to it, need to be part of that discussion. From a Microsoft perspective, we've done a lot over the past 3.5 years to try to broaden this discussion. I mentioned, for example, that the United Nations group of government experts has been meeting, and they recently came to some agreements. And they basically sort of settled on 3 things. 1, every government should have a CERT, and these CERTs should be used for defensive purposes. A CERT is a computer emergency response team. And then secondly, they agreed that, okay, CERTs are for good. Governments should not attack CERTs. Okay, that's good. And then they decided that government should not attack critical infrastructure. So these are 3 sort of good things. I don't think they go far enough, and I don't think they appreciate the scale and complexity of cyber. And here's why. First of all, CERTs are very small organizations that typically coordinate information about patching and vulnerability and effects of malware. They're not entities that do attribution. They don't actually have any sort of command authority in their countries. It varies little by countries, but even if you look at the US government, for example, the US CERT could make put out a requirement for the agencies. It might take those agencies 30, 60, 90, 120 days to actually comply. So it's not like command and control from that aspect. And then when you get to the issue of, hey, hands off critical infrastructure, no. What is critical infrastructure? You know, there are at least 20 different definitions floating around the world. Everyone sort of normalizes around 17 or 18 sectors, but if you really look at it, IT is not covered. So information technology, the very platform that they're using for exploitation and attack, is not covered in this. And we think that should be covered somehow. And how do you do that? So we put a couple of ideas on the table to start with. One is, we really should have an international process about how we manage vulnerability disclosure. You know, today, governments buy vulnerabilities on the open market, and it sort of collapses a model that the private sector has had for years of working with security researchers, understanding where those vulnerabilities are, and then patching them in our products and citing the researcher for their discovery once the patch is released and people are protected. When you don't handle vulnerabilities in a responsible way, or you stockpile them for a national security attack, and then it goes public, you create something that's known as a 0-day that sends the world scrambling to fix things. And that's a very dangerous perspective, particularly when you have something that could have a cascading effect, or something that criminals could look at and say, well, that's a really interesting string of code. I could use this to make money. And then you see a set of copycat attacks. That's a very hard thing for the private sector to turn on a dime and fix. And so that's one thing that we think governments should actually start to commit to. Last year, the US government came out and said that they were going to stop stockpiling vulnerabilities and start an equities process to determine what they might share with the private sector. Currently, the Department of Commerce is working through some things on that. So we're hopeful that this is the beginning. There's lots of discussions in Europe about what responsible vulnerability disclosure is and should be. The private sector has worked really hard. We actually have an international standard that we've helped develop on how to do this, how to notify the person who's responsible for fixing it and how to work with them through the fixing process, and then how to notify the broader community. The other thing we've looked at is we think it's important that states actually exercise some restraint in cyber weapons, much the way that they have in kinetic weapons. You know, there's been a big push in military doctrine to make traditional kinetic weapons very precise and targeted, so you limit impacts to the civilian population. If you're building a cyber weapon, it better be precise and limited and targeted, because everybody's plugged in to cyberspace. And if it starts to have broad effects, particularly as you move to a services-based world or a cloud-based world, that's really disruptive and unnerving. We also think that there may be things the government can do, governments working together to stop the proliferation of certain types of malware or code. You may have heard recently there was an agreement by 20 countries, a long-standing agreement called the Wassenaar Agreement, that was really designed in the Cold War to control dual-use technologies that could fall into the wrong hands and be used for bad things. In December of 2013, they updated this and added a whole provision on ICT. These were cyber technologies that governments thought, hey, maybe it's not a good idea if these should move around. They didn't consult the private sector, and so as a result, you suddenly ended up with these really kind of awkward moments where, let's say the Department of the Commerce in the US might have controlled maybe 3,000 sort of technologies that were sort of on this list before. By putting this down from an ICT perspective, they suddenly grew from potentially one company alone, 4,500 new things they would have to try to manage and track and control. They totally caught them by surprise. And then you have the idea of some of these things are actually used primarily for defense. So why would we stop those from moving around? And secondly, I don't think it's actually enforceable in the approach they're taking. So again, this is one of these things where I think governments thought about the right approach, but without the connection with the private sector, we sort of have a gap. Now, clearly the private sector, we're not a sovereign entity. we're not a monolith. We are a diverse set of companies and competitors and innovators, and we certainly don't have unified positions. But the one thing we do share is a global customer base. And those are customers who have expectations that we're providing secure, private, and reliable experiences on a global basis. And that means a lot of very difficult things happen. We make decisions on a daily basis that affect billions of users. So how do we square that with government interests in military investments? Today, there are about 42 governments in the world who have some sort of military doctrine on their use of cyberspace. We have about 17 to 20 governments that have actually made or been open about investments in offensive cyber capabilities. And at the same time, this is causing a great deal of insecurity in the international system. So states have a couple ways of dealing with insecurity. They'll either ramp up military investments, so even governments like Denmark decide, oh, we're going to invest in offensive cyber. Okay, check that. But the other way states manage cybersecurity risk is through regulatory policy. So let's lock things down. Let's reduce our attack surface. So we now have about 95 governments in the world who are writing cybersecurity laws. And I think the tension that you get is, on one hand, governments are exploiting cyber capabilities for military purposes and intelligence purposes. And at the same time, governments want to regulate the use of cyber things so they feel like they're protected. And what is at risk in the middle is actually innovation. And I think long term, we have to try to understand what those costs are and then start to factor that back into, okay, well, what's the framework you would think about in terms of restraint? Are there certain sort of norms that should be done to restrict things from an offensive perspective? Are there certain things that we could all agree to from a defensive perspective? And industry, are there things that you can and should be doing in this space that you're going to commit to? So I think we're really in the early stages of this. We have a lot more work to do together. And one of the things that's really interesting about being here at the University of Washington is the work that you're doing with international public policy really creates a great opportunity to bring pretty diverse communities together, both the government, the private sector, and I would say really importantly, the academic community. You know, what we lack in the international space is really a framework to think about these issues. You know, government people get a policy briefing and they have to respond. Industry people are responding to that policy briefing, and we're going back and forth with each other. And sometimes it is the academics who have the ability to sort of look broadly and not be constrained by crisis du jour, to be able to set a framework and bring these communities together. And I think that's really important. And I'd like to see more of that in the future if we're going to succeed in this space.